Looking at partition becomes difficult because there are no easily identifiable aggressors and victims. In many ways, we are all complicit in perpetrating the violence or in remaining silent about it, and to address that kind of trauma is that much more difficult.
Violence engulfed and affected large groups. It targeted women as symbols of their families, communities, and their nations. Targeting women was a new phenomenon for the subcontinent.
Older women who refuse to admit the trauma of their desexualization are likely to become anxious when they observe younger women who enjoy more sexual freedom than they did.
Sadly, even now, communitarian identities are now thought to be sufficient to explain the subjective psyche and the overt behavior of persons.
Succeeding generations of survivors of trauma can be deeply affected by something that did not directly happen to them. Like other important issues of our times, ecology, social media, financial markets, rise of nationalism, and the ongoing pandemic, collective violence and its traumatic consequences are also global in their scope. Many societies are seriously affected by and carry within them memories of collective violence between large groups, painful recollections passed through generations. My own memories of traumatic collective violence are from the violence between Hindus and Muslims at the partition of the country between two separate states of India and Pakistan, when tens of millions crossed the newly laid boundaries in either direction as refugees and millions lost their lives. But before I come to my own takeaways on trauma and its mitigation from my personal case history, let me make some general remarks on collective trauma and its intergenerational transmission. We generally think of trauma as an overwhelming experience that our mind cannot process at the time. Psychic trauma is not what has actually happened to the child or adult. It is the mind's response to what has happened that determines the overwhelming emotions that constitute the traumatic experience and its subsequent influence. Individuals have a need for a certain amount of distance from trauma before they can begin to allow themselves to intensely re-experience the affects associated with the event, or for that matter, critically reflect on their experience and create meanings for it. Some experiences are just too frightening and humiliating to remember, and the survivor needs to forget it until they are ready to deal with these experiences, if ever. Psychoanalysts have identified various responses to the trauma, both with individuals and in groups, before they are ready to engage with it. The various responses are: 1. Denial, what happened did not happen. 2. Survivor guilt, why them and not us. 3. Identification with the aggressor, we had it coming. 4th, perversion of judgment, the victims were guilty, and later a fascination with criminals and mass destruction. 5. Revival of catastrophes, it is the Holocaust again, nothing will ever be the same again. And finally, 6. Trivialization through a proliferation and sophistication of commentaries going hand in hand with the anesthetizing of feelings. The traumatic experience that we are dealing with here, the partition of India, traumatic, is the one that cannot be contained by one generation, and necessarily and largely unconsciously plays itself out through the next generation. A traumatic history doesn't have to be one's own, but might repeat or pass on the history of previous generations. As has been remarked in a different context, a baby is the only person in a family without a past. Soon enough, his parents provide him with theirs. Psychoanalysts have claimed, mostly based on the treatment of the survivors of the Holocaust and that of their children and grandchildren, that there are intergenerational secrets and unprocessed experiences that loom in our minds when unspoken events and memories of one generation haunt the next one. Succeeding generations of survivors of trauma can be deeply affected by something that did not directly happen to them. We should again remember that the impact of trauma effects on its survivors is not uniform, and thus the transgenerational transmission of a trauma is not inevitable. In an empirical study, Siegel and Weinfeld found evidence that Holocaust survivors had psychological and physical impairment some 3.5 decades after the end of World War II. However, not all survivors were psychologically impaired. Fully 64% of the male survivors and 35% of female survivors did not give evidence of psychiatric impairment. Surprisingly, Siegel and Weinfeld found some positive long-term effects of persecution on survivors, at least based on judgments made by their offspring. There was a tendency for more positive attitudes towards family and heightened ethnic identification as Jews. Let me now come back to trauma, its generational transmission and possible mitigation through a case history, my own personal experience of the partition trauma. I was 9 years old at that time, and we lived in Rohtak, a small town west of Delhi. As the killings and lootings raged uncontrolled in the villages and towns of Punjab, more and more members of my father's extended family poured into Rohtak as refugees from Lahore, where they had lived for many generations and which now lay in the freshly created state of Pakistan. The rooms and verandas of our house became sprawling dormitories with mats and darris spread close to each other as uncles, aunts, and cousins of varying degrees of kinship lived and slept in intimate confusion. With the loss of their homes and places of work, with the snapping of long-standing friendships and other social ties, there was little for the refugees to do in our house except seek comfort from the sharing of each other's partition violence experiences. This they did in groups, which continuously changed in their membership as they shifted from one room of the house to another. The children were sometimes shooed out and sometimes ignored, as gruesome stories of murderous violence were told and retold. It is sobering to think of hundreds of thousands of children over many parts of the Indian subcontinent, Hindu and Muslim, who have listened to stories from their parents and other family elders during the partition on the fierceness of an implacable enemy. This is the primary channel through which historical trauma is transmitted from one generation to the next, as the child hears the note of helpless fury and impotence in accounts of beloved adults and fantasizes scenarios of revenge against those who have humiliated his family and kin. These fantasies, which later sink back into the subconscious, dim memories that can get revived in contexts perceived to be similar to the Hindu-Muslim violence of the partition, are a vindication of the parents and a repayment of the debt owed them. Given the strong kinship and family ties all over the country, a Hindu's enmity towards a Muslim and vice versa is often experienced by the individual as part of the loyalty due to the parents and other older members of the family. Much later, I began to reflect on the healing of traumatic experiences, on how important it was to have family groups for individuals to be able to speak of their traumatic experiences without resorting to the defensive responses which I mentioned earlier, such as denial, survivor guilt, and so on. and how important it was for the children that the adults felt stronger and more in control. With children whose envelope of safety has been breached by horrific violence suffered by their group, our diagnoses and interventions are often guided by personal factors unique to the individual child as we seek to assess the child's resiliency to the trauma, the child's temperament, personal history, age and stage of development, level of anxiety, security of early attachments, and so on. The kind of interventions we make with these children would shift if the resiliency of the child's group, extended family, community became the focus and not the individual child. We would then need to know the meaning the group attributes to the violence. For instance, whether the violence is seen as inevitable, a recurrent event in the group's history whose effects too shall pass, or as a one-time occurrence in which the group is singled out for divine wrath as a consequence of sinful behavior that needs urgent redressal. There are, of course, other meanings that different culture groups attribute to the violence. Our interventions will then be indirect, focused on the group's own attempts to cope with the horror and terror of the violence it has experienced. The emphasis then would be on strengthening the caretakers to strengthen the cared for children. To do so both sensitively and effectively, we not only need to know the stories a child's culture tells about violence, but also how does the culture dream of lives in and out of balance? How does the culture sing of meaning and of one's place in the universe and tell the story of individual and collective purpose and the hazards along the way? How does the culture go to the liminal edge of meaning that unsettles, perplexes, and demand answers to that which will always be beyond us? Healing victims of collective trauma need not only an individual but also a community-centered approach. Thank you.
How do we remember and forget memories of collective and individual trauma? How do generations who have no experience of the traumatic events negotiate with post-memories? In the context of South Asia, the partition of 1947 and its afterlife provides us an original template to reflect on these questions. August 1947 ushered in realities that would continue to impact the history of the South Asian subcontinent for years to come. Two new nation states, India and a divided Pakistan, emerged out of the political partition, and the British formally quit their jewel in the crown. Punjab and Bengal, two provinces with majority Muslim populations, were divided along religious lines. West Punjab and East Bengal going to Pakistan, and East Punjab and West Bengal remaining in India. Pakistan received a larger share of the erstwhile Punjab and Bengal provinces, both of which would have distinct futures. In subsequent decades, West Punjab became the epicenter of the nation state of Pakistan, while East Bengal, or East Pakistan, broke away in 1971 to form the new nation state of Bangladesh. In effect, there were three simultaneous partitions of British India, of the province of Bengal, and of the province of Punjab. Their political and socio-economic experiences differed depending on region, community, and class. An alternative way to think about the three partitions is to think of them conceptually as three different moments which are part of the same event. Whichever framework we choose, we find that the partition, its history, memory, and legacies don't follow a single or a straight line and did not begin and end in the year 1947. Rather, the partition unfolded over a long period of time and was a complex, often incomplete, web of political trajectories. The hallmark of the partition was its divergent experiences that depended on gender, religion, region, caste, age, and time. The act of dividing and untangling two nations was undertaken within 6 short months and involved high-level political decisions. British officials, in conjunction with All India Muslim League and the All India National Congress, met behind closed doors to decide the demarcation of new international borders, the allocation of financial resources, and the division of the armed forces, civil servants, and bureaucratic departments. In fact, the past itself was to be partitioned as museums and their collections, archives, and records were divided between the two nations. The partition brought freedom to India and Pakistan, but also engendered the largest forced migration in the history of the 20th century. Between 1946 and 1965, nearly 9 million Hindus and Sikhs moved into India, and approximately 5 million Muslims moved to both parts of Pakistan. The resulting massive displacement made refugee rehabilitation one of the primary agendas in the post-1947 restructuring of India and Pakistan. However, even 2 months before August 1947, there was hardly anyone who could surely predict such a horrific future marked by displacement, insecurity, and trauma. That the British would leave India was certainly in the general mind, but how and when was up for debate. Then why did it happen? How did the partition of British India become the only solution in 1947 agreed upon by the British, the Congress, and the Muslim League? How and why did regional leaders in Bengal and Punjab support the move to divide their provinces in spite of the inevitable issues of displacement that would arise? Were there any alternatives to the partition? Most importantly, was the partition inevitable? The partition was not inevitable, but a search for causes have led generations of historians to different conclusions regarding why it happened. Some suggest that fundamental differences between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs are the root cause of the division. Some have blamed the British colonial rule for the gradual erosion of interwoven community identities and shared traditions. This, they argue, led to the emergence of distinct communities based on religion that had political weight. Thus, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs demanded inclusion within distinct nations. Others find blame in the actions of major political figures of the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and within the demands for a homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent. Recent scholarship has persuasively overturned the argument for age-old communal differences between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Rather, there is some agreement that partition happened due to more short-term political decisions, and even till the end, regional leaders in Bengal and Punjab continued to weigh different possibilities with the aim for a united India. The demand for a Muslim homeland, that is Pakistan, is often seen as a central reason for the partition. However, we know that the demand for Pakistan came not from Muslims in Bengal and Punjab, where they were a majority, but from the northern Indian state of UP, where they were a minority. Moreover, Pakistan meant different things to different groups of Muslims, and not all of them supported the idea. For rural Bengali Muslims, Pakistan was a peasant utopia, which promised freedom from the Hindu landlord domination. For minority Muslims in UP and Bihar, it evoked the idea of a new Medina. Its geographical contours were deliberately vague to allow those who supported the concept to project their ideas onto it. Whatever the meanings and imaginings, it was only in the mid-1940s that the idea of Pakistan became synonymous with partition. While the causes of partition continue to animate public and academic discussions, the human experience of the division has become central to how we understand what happened during and after 1947. As millions moved across newly created borders, uncertain about their future, violence became a way in which such uncertainties manifested among communities. Violence engulfed and affected large groups, irrespective of caste, class, religion, and gender. Violence began with the riots in Calcutta in August 1946, then in Punjab in March 1947. It continued to rage in the immediate aftermath of 1947. It targeted women as symbols of their families, communities, and their nations. Targeting women was a new phenomenon for the subcontinent. More than 100,000 women were abducted on both sides of the border. The death toll remains disputed to this day, with figures ranging from 200,000 to 1 million. The experience of violence and migration differed in the north and the east. Punjab and northern India witnessed mass violence and a swift displacement of their populations, both of which petered out by 1949. Bengal and eastern India underwent small-scale routine violence and chronic migration patterns that lasted until 1971, when the independence of Bangladesh impacted the region differently. At one level, the horrors of partition violence were retributive to their core, as tales of trains arriving with dead bodies fueled the subsequent bouts of rioting. Propaganda, tacit support of neighbors, and a desire to loot all played into an already communalized environment. At another level, the brutality of the violence can partly be explained by the presence of recently demobilized ex-soldiers of the British Indian Army who had combat experience and access to arms and ammunition. Partition violence was also routine and small-scale and individualized. In divided Bengal, violence threatened the psyche through sporadic stabbings, lootings, and destruction of properties, defacement of places of worship, and verbal threats. Together, they created an ecology of fear and insecurity that engendered chronic mass migration for years to come. Partition migration changed the demographic composition of entire cities such as Lahore, Amritsar, Karachi, Delhi, and Dhaka. Why and when did people decide to move, and what were their experiences of migration? How did people cope being divided across two nations? How can we access these memories of violence, the trauma of uprooting, and the experiences of refugee life? Going beyond archives, scholars have sought answers in contemporary memoirs, fictions, films, and artistic representations. Representations of the human experience of partition are immortalized in stories of writers like Sadat Hasan Manto, Ismat Chugtai, Bapsi Sidhwa, Atin Bandopadhyay, Jyotirmoy Devi, and many others. Films such as Garam Hawa and Meghe Dhaka Tara represented the plight of refugees and the framing of national identities. Oral interviews of survivors and perpetrators of refugees and citizens continue to provide us with significant understandings of individual experiences of partition. While in the case of the Holocaust, Marian Harsh's post-memory has been an important tool in understanding the transmission of trauma through intergenerational remembering, in the case of the partition, one also has to think about such transmission through intergenerational forgetting. In India and Pakistan, we are now witnessing increasing efforts to create institutional memories through the establishment of the Partition Museum in Amritsar and the Oral History Project based out of Karachi and Lahore. Efforts to capture the generational memories of partition are ongoing through various online portals, such as the Partition Archive, based out of Berkeley, USA, and Project Dastan, based in the UK. Oral narratives and partition memories has drawn attention to the disjunction between nationalized histories and the personal narrative of 1947. They highlight how collective and individual memories of partition violence are mediated along caste, class, and gendered lines. In giving voice and agency to non-elite Indians and Pakistanis, such a shift has to grapple with some uncomfortable conclusions. For example, the human experiences of partition violence indicate that not everyone was a victim. Some individuals were perpetrators. While acknowledging other factors such as the role of grassroots leaders, complicity of partisan members of the police and the military, and the failure of the British colonial state to protect the people, the fact remains that partition violence pitted neighbors, friends, and communities against each other. Including human experiences also broadens the narrative of partition that had primarily concentrated on Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and accounts for limited to upper caste and upper class memories. Recent histories of the partition have attempted to render those who had been invisible in the earlier narrative, the untouchables, or the Dalits. The focus on Dalit politics in the run-up to the partition, their experiences of migration and violence, and within the Indian state's rehabilitation efforts are significant in not only revising the erasure, but also to complicate partition's histories. History is often at odds with both official and public memory. In the case of the subcontinent, the narrative of nationhood determines and differentiates such memories depending on one's regional location. For Indians, remembering the partition means recalling the dark side of independence, a moment of loss, a moment when not only was the country divided, but families separated, exiled, and forced out of homelands into foreign lands. In contrast, Pakistanis remember 1947 as the year when a religiously informed nation, homeland, and identity were realized for minority Muslims in British India. Partition is thus framed as independence from the perceived threat of Hindu majoritarianism. The reality that not all Muslims align themselves with such an idea or move to Pakistan after 1947 detracts little from this memory of the partition. In Bangladesh, the memory of 1947 has been almost erased by the substitution of another partition, that of 1971, when East Pakistan broke away from West Pakistan and became an independent nation state. People in the subcontinent and their diaspora worldwide inhabit a world that remains profoundly shaped by the events and experiences of 1947 and its aftermath. The legacies of partition continue to impact ongoing political conflicts, frame understandings of communal relationships between Hindus and Muslims, and create and influence memories and stories within families who remain divided across borders. 70 years down the line, the narrative of partition is very much with us and is being actively framed not only through international diplomacy on cases such as Kashmir and Assam, but also through collective post-memories and post-amnesias of partition's grand and great-grandchildren. Thank you.
Psychoanalytic theories on intergenerational trauma have some unique features in the Indian geography. I'm going to describe some of those features today via the example of an intergenerational cumulative trauma, the regulation of expressions of women's sexuality in India. Psychoanalysts use the term cumulative trauma to differentiate large-scale traumas that have a definite endpoint from traumas that derive from stressors that a child experiences while dependent on its parents for its well-being. Cumulative trauma takes place when the parent's protective role towards the child is breached. In sexuality, this role of the parents is as an auxiliary ego, a substitute for the child's own undeveloped capacities. An auxiliary ego provides protection and permission for sexual excitement and aggression at a time where the child's own ego function, its capacity to manage excitement as well as to decide what excitements are permissible, is immature and unstable. In the Indian context, until recently, caregivers have not been able to provide this auxiliary ego which protects and permits girls' sexual excitement and aggression. An internalization of the group ego diverts parents from their protective responsibility as individuals, bending them instead to the patriarchal community. Well-controlled female sexuality is the thing that holds up the community psyche. It has been used for centuries in India as psychological scaffolding for the group. Dramatic controls of female sexuality reflect the intensity of memory and of longing for community love. The intensity of community identification sets Indians apart from citizens of the famously weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries, where one is always first an individual and then a community member. By contrast, in India, the I am and the we are birthed simultaneously in the imagination. Studies in cumulative trauma tell us that cumulative trauma is never recognized in the moment that it happens. At the time when cumulative trauma occurs, in the case of women's sexuality, when the parents fail to protect the child from the community demands, the child is still in a position where it needs to idealize the parent. Refusing to recognize the trauma is a way of continuing the idealization and the identification with the parent. As such, instead of controls of female sexuality being experienced as an aggression or as an oppression, they are often experienced as a heritage, an ontology passed along from parent to child, a contribution to the group adhesiveness, identity, and well-being, an investment that earns rich dividends of group safety, comfort, closeness, and love. Thus, the recognition of controlled sexuality as a cumulative trauma does not happen until later for women, when there is a surge of memory upon exposure to a triggering stimulus. So, as an example of a moment when this trauma awakens, consider the following anecdote. This took place at a 2018 literature festival in the Indian metropolis of Pune. As a participant in the festival, I had been part of a panel on medieval Indian erotic art and literature. During the audience question hour, a woman in her mid-20s raised her hand. She was dressed in a pantsuit, speaking in articulate English, two external signals of Indian modernity. First, she politely thanked us for our panel, and then her voice shifted in tone. Entering an angry register, she asked her question with palpable annoyance. "So what?" she said. "So what if there's a yes for women's sexuality in Indian medieval literature? Does that make any difference for me? Look at my conservative parents. Look at my commute to work." For this young woman, our literature panel on the positive aspects of Indian sexuality in ancient times had been overwhelmingly provocative. She became more and more agitated. And then she said, "I keep saying no, no, no the whole day. I'm so exhausted from saying no. Could any of you answer how I'm going to get to a yes?" When a discussion on sexuality in medieval India can ignite an experience of disappointment, annoyance, and a re-experiencing of harassment, we can understand how refused sexual expression has become a form of cumulative trauma. Psychoanalyst Adam Phillips reminds us, quote, "In trauma, something is remembered that would rather be forgotten," unquote. Lost sexual agency becomes evident as a trauma when a situation that celebrates female sexuality nevertheless evokes unpleasant and unbearable memories. For the woman in my example, though the perpetrators of the trauma were nowhere in physical sight, they're immediately remembered when the forbidden and open discussion on female sexuality takes place. The traumatic memory transforms a physically safe environment, the comfortable, easy ambience of a literary festival, into a psychologically unsafe one. What are the mechanisms of trauma transmission that makes discussions and performances of female libido psychologically unsafe for women in India? Empirical research implicates three factors that function worldwide to suppress female sexuality: gossip, reputation, and maternal socialization. All three of these factors are affected by external and internalized experiences of group spectatorship. How much you feel subject to gossip, how much you feel subject to reputation, depends upon where the group is located in your imagination. How much you are affected by maternal socialization depends on how the desire for love, harmony, and oneness with the mother sits with the desire to experience life, including sexuality, independently and autonomously. On the psychoanalyst's couch, some women patients share memories of their mother's disgust, recoil, or punishment at their sexual expression or sharing of moments of pleasure. Other women share memories of their mother's sexual unhappiness and the guilt and protectiveness it inspires in them. When these memories come alive in adulthood, they create a bias in the experience and the expression of women's libido. Yet, in this trauma, the yearning for mother's love often endures deeper than the hatred of the traumatic and sexually suppressive message. So, if a woman hates sexual oppression but loves the mother who taught it to her, she may still enact the content of sexual oppression upon herself and experience it as a form of miserable loyalty. Why did mothers fail to serve as an auxiliary ego that would protect the daughters from the stringent norms of patriarchy? One reason is because their own internalization of the norm of women's sexual control prevented them from being the auxiliary protective ego for their daughters. To transmit sexual control was to be a good mother, to secure a place for both mother and daughter in the composite community identity, and its dividends of psychological closeness, connection, and harmony. What prevents mothers from seeing their daughters' need for protection are their own losses, shored up by their denial of female suppressed libido. But the leaks of intergenerational sexual envy and deprivation cannot be covered up, even if the trauma of sexual control is denied. One example of such a leak can be seen in a May 2019 Times Now news channel clip that went viral in India. The news clip shows a middle-aged woman shopping at a mall in Gurugram, a city 30 kilometers southwest of New Delhi. The older woman sees a group of younger women dressed in pants and sleeve blouses, also shopping. She becomes agitated and angry at the younger women's attire, and she begins to scream at them. "Your short dresses are asking to get you raped," she yells. "You are damaged," the young women scream back. "This is none of your business." The fracas continues for several minutes. "You all are encouraging rape," the older woman's words ricochet over and over again in the news clip. When trauma is denied, it always requires more recruits to sustain the denial. Older women who refuse to admit the trauma of their desexualization are likely to become anxious when they observe younger women who enjoy more sexual freedom than they did. It is the uniform performance of female sexual suppression that fuels group harmony in patriarchy. No one is liberated also means no one is left behind. A grim loyalty. When needs for a unified group identity in India grew in intensity around the time of independence in the 1940s and 50s, the trauma of women's sexual suppression collided with the trauma of the post-colonial subject. A further form of loyalty was demanded from women amongst the generation of women who were India's first political citizens after independence. Feminists of this generation struck the hard bargain of being political subjects and experiencing unity and identity as political citizens of India in exchange for giving up being sexual subjects. The Tamil writer and feminist C.S. Lakshmi, born in 1944, writes of her generation, "The body was absent in our imagination. We were dwelling in bodiless space." When sexual subjectivity is given up initially, its trauma can still be experienced later in life. C.S. Lakshmi also writes of her generation, quote, "Women of my generation grew up with a very different idea of freedom. It meant being able to go about, talk to people, and do things like speak in English. But there was a core which we understood or were told were our cultural values. Initially," she writes, "these women may not have thought about what these cultural values were. But when defiant daughters emerged from their wombs, the women had to go back to the shackles they experienced and call those shackles culture." End quote. Aside from the denial of sexuality demanded from independence-era feminists, another, more subtle form of intergenerational transmission takes place when women identify with feminine sexual aesthetics, which are also passed along intergenerationally. So cultural products like literature, poetry, and art transmit cultural ideas of beauty in sexual love that construct women as dependent upon male libido. When these cultural products are unconsciously absorbed, no matter how women are exposed to global feminism, no matter how much they are exposed to global feminism, many women still may desire to feel small, submissive, protected, pretty, modest, excitedly waiting to be ignited by male libido. Sexual aesthetics throw a wrench in the works of a unilateral narrative of sexual suppression by introducing the complex notion of desirable suppression. Both clinical and field studies in India suggest that a taste for feminine sexual aesthetics creates a sexual dependence upon male libido that's both physical and psychological. This dependence on male libido may be desirable in the bedroom, but rapidly becomes traumatic when it gets extended to the boardroom, to other non-sexual domains. So what bearing do these intersections of family loyalties and aesthetic preferences in sexuality have on the process of healing this cumulative trauma? In global psychoanalysis, as a result of the events of World War II, Western psychoanalysis found grieving and speaking about grief central to the processing of trauma. Likewise, in India, mourning is necessary. We must grieve the cumulative trauma of controls on women's sexuality. But because of the nature of the trauma, there is a difference. When mourning a trauma involves beloved figures from the family and beloved experiences like the sexual aesthetics of patriarchy, there's a risk for mourning to become an erotic activity in its own right. Then, rather than being forward-moving, mourning pays melancholic homage to beloved figures and ideas. It remembers and repeats the trauma rather than working it through. When eros is buried thus in mourning, the task becomes to gently highlight sexual fantasies, pleasures, and competitions that are narrated in the low tones of mourning. Keeping eros in mind for the woman while facing with her the fear, disgust, and loathing that she once faced alone holds the possibility of yielding a sexual history beyond trauma. Thank you.
As a psychiatrist and as a teacher, the silence in the clinical field on the issue of psychological sequelae of partition has been a gaping black hole. We will try to track how thinking about psychological issues in the clinic and in society evolved in the recent past and why the silence thus becomes deafening. In the riots that followed the partition of India into two states, several million were displaced and hundreds of thousands were killed. But even with so many victims, no perpetrators were ever identified, and the trauma was, in a way, accepted. The euphoria of freedom, a newfound patriotism, the waiting for detachment to be objective, the immenseness of the problem, and perhaps too few mental health professionals. These can be the several pragmatic reasons why this was so in professional debates and concerns. All in all, a curtain was hastily drawn on the impact of all this violence and chaos on the nuts and bolts of society, on the schools, the hospitals, and civic life, including the life of the mind. Thus, we never had a questioning of the events, unlike the response to the Holocaust in Europe that happened around the same time, or the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa much later, or a conscious acceptance of guilt and blame. This was true of society at large, but worryingly, even of the subsequent generations of mental health professionals who could have addressed and worked through this, perhaps with some validity. As a small experiment, a colleague and I shared vignettes of the accounts as case notes of the survivors, which had been collected decades after this experience with mental health professionals, with a small explanatory note about why we were soliciting participation. Only a handful agreed to provide responses, but there was almost complete unanimity on the diagnosis. That is, if they were to encounter these situations in the clinic, post-traumatic stress disorder or a prolonged depression would be the working diagnosis, and counseling, and if necessary, pharmacological treatments would be offered. Thus, the bare clinical fact that there was sadness, hopelessness, and a sense of personal trauma was easily recognized by clinicians decades after. The concepts of depression, guilt, dysphoria, and ennui as matters of clinical concern developed from psychological thinking in the 19th and 20th centuries. The secularization of the body by science and medicine through the millennium ultimately gave rise to attempts to secularize the mind, even in places that were introduced to these ideas through colonialism. In South Asia too, practitioners such as James S. Dale in Calcutta and Martin Honigberger in Lahore commented in the mid-19th century that healing by spells, as practiced by fakirs and mendicants, was actually much the same as mesmerism. Mesmer, of course, had influenced both Charcot and Freud. In any case, Asylum records the use of psychotherapy in clinics and dispensaries, and accounts by Indian practitioners like Chetan Das suggest that ideas about understanding and helping those in psychological distress were being developed and incorporated into the clinic quite at the same time as in Europe. However, colonial attitudes and racism, as also perhaps the barriers within Indian society, soon neglected the inner psychological space of the people. The early psychiatrists of the 20th century, the British ones, like Owen and Overbeck Wright, were quite emphatic that psychiatric illnesses in India were much the same as in Britain. Overbeck Wright described the treatment of hysteria in an Indian soldier who had developed fits after passing urine on the tomb of a saint by mistake and thought himself cursed and possessed by a jinn. He recovered, as Overbeck writes, by tactful reasoning, gentle but firm management, full nutrition, and removal from ordinary surroundings. In a sharp response, another psychiatrist, more analytically minded, rebuked the writer for not exploring processes suggested by Freud and Jung, of sticking to the Scottish organic view and pandering to the malign influence of mechanistic materialism. Perhaps this was the impish and iconoclastic Owen Berkeley Hill, who was convinced that the modern psychoanalytically based ideas about the mind of man were essential to manage psychological symptoms, and worked through the fossilized religiosity of Indians, both Hindu and Muslim, as also the colonial attitudes of the British, from which in any case he had been cast apart for marrying an Indian. He held all these in poor esteem, and trying to analyze and treat the antagonism between Hindu and Muslim suggested that they share a totem and taboo transgressing meal as an option to settle the Hindu-Muslim problem forever. Girindra Shekhar Bose tried to integrate the idea of psychoanalysis into clinical practice in Calcutta and establish the Indian Psychoanalytical Society. Though an avowed nationalist, in his writings and in the deliberations of the society, there is little attention paid to the communal politics or indeed the violence that happened around them. At the more academic centers of psychiatry, which were now managed by Indian professionals in the asylums of Agra, Madras, and Bangalore, often regarded psychoanalysis as a strain on one's credulity or the cult of imagined memories, and went so far as to suggest that it posed an ideal example of the threats to the development of psychiatry in India. D. Satyanand, the Deputy Medical Superintendent of the Lahore Mental Hospital and a teacher at the Amritsar Medical School in the Punjab, was perhaps a closer witness to the strains that were developing in people's minds, and the communal issues became intertwined with religious identity and political destiny. In a detailed dream analysis of Mrs. A, he discusses the issue of Hindu socialism that Mrs. A was struggling with. This Hindu socialism was nationalistic without being chauvinistic and moored in the politics of the time, in which he tried to develop what he called a total self-analysis. This, in addition to following some of the methods of psychoanalysis, also relied on myths and metaphors from Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, as also ideas from Austen, Iqbal, and Hegel. He often interacted with subjects who were aware of the simmering tensions in the social milieu of Punjab, but perhaps not of the horrors lurking around the corner. These developments were consonant with the wider debates of the time in India. In the early 20th century, it had been fondly hoped that the spread of modernity would make the distinctions of race and religion wither, and that the ideas of race or civilizational incompatibility that arose out of an unenlightened psychological repulsion, in quotes, would soon vanish. Thinkers like Brajendranath Seal, G.K. Gokhale, Sister Nivedita, and William Du Bois, in a meeting at the League of Nations, hoped that universal humanism would soon prevail, towards the achievement of which nationalism was just a transitory halting stage. However, the use of psychological traits or social behaviors as a basis for nationalism to be granted or denied was used often enough in Europe itself soon after, and in the retreat of colonization all over the world, as the emphasis on psychological differences was then used to create a common, even national identity or an enemy. In the 1940s, as a harbinger of this, Vakil called this clamor for constant division and subdivision by religion, caste, language, and ethnicity a political insanity. This regrettable space, where different communities enter different ideological and cultural worlds, read different newspapers, think different thoughts, and a pervasive provincialism which needed to be replaced by a sense of common destiny. In contrast, nationalism and conflict in India suggested that the social behaviors and attitudes of Muslims were sufficient to qualify them almost as separate species of humans, as there was no shared experience of cultural life in India, and there was an unbridgeable gap between the two communities. Beni Prasad, the professor of psychology at the Allahabad University, suggested that social psychotherapy was essential if India had to free itself from the traditional, older manifestations that were more suited to an environment of a negative and absolutist government, and that to speak of Hindus and Muslims as separate civilizations is to equate the whole of civilization with religious creed and the resultant magnification of non-essentials. In preventing this, there was thus an opportunity for India, as it may have to contribute a humanism of its own, as a liberal and humanitarian polity was to be the essence of a future India. The violence, as it happened in the mid-40s and towards the end, was often referred to in psychodynamic terms. For example, the hysterical urge of Muslims to serve in the West and of Hindus and Sikhs to serve in the East. Or, to use the current psychological jargon, the average educated Indian is compelled to rationalize, as a Freudian defense, the behavior of his countrymen, while the mood of the government called for sedatives rather than shock treatments. The violence often took particularly sadistic forms and was described in one report as Belsen without the gas chambers. Gandhi, as did many others, referred to the violence as a sign of madness and issued a plea for sanity less than a fortnight before his assassination. In the midst of all this, the Friends Ambulance Services Unit by Horace and Alexander in Calcutta tried to provide help and create a process whereby the psychological distancing between the communities could be reduced. Contributing to their inquiry into the means of resolving racial, religious, class and national misapprehensions and conflicts, an ambitious title, N.S.N. Sastry, a psychologist from Mysore, felt that the violence could be based on an unresolved Oedipal complex, an inferiority complex, or an unconscious fear, invoking Freud, Adler and Jung in his deliberations. In a telling comment in the Friends meetings, it was noted that the abyss in the soul of the perpetrator would take longer to heal than the victim. Specifically, it was felt that too much romanticism of the goodness of humans needed to be avoided. Thus, the fact that the violence would extract a heavy toll on psychological health on both sides was quite obvious. The notes of the Friends ambulance and scattered medical records provided description of what would now be called PTSD or sheer terror. However, there are no accessible public records of medical or psychological issues, and we are forced to rely on autobiographical accounts. These were collected and addressed in some detail by Gardner Murphy, the American psychologist who was entrusted to study the social tensions in India on behalf of the UNESCO in the aftermath of the violence. He was assisted by Parsram, a psychologist from Lahore and a member of the Indian Psychoanalytical Society and the Psychiatric Society. They noted that the sense of fractured identity, a loss of a sense of shared consciousness, and the fact that the Hindus and Muslims had grown apart socially only in the past 2 decades and were thus unlikely to have a common response to the shared hardship of the violence, mirroring what Vakil had warned against. As a present observation, Gardner Murphy hoped that the indigenous roots of strength, faith and continuity needed to be protected and nurtured, especially as in the name of development, literacy may be increased to 90%, but will the deeper literacy of understanding remain? That India is a pluralistic, diverse, but unified society and nation soon became a strident statement of faith, even propaganda, under the assumption that the terrors and fears of the partition had been assuaged and the good work of national integration across religion and ethnic identities in one secular Indian nation state now had a strong foundation. However, since the trauma had not been worked through, whether this was repression or denial and whether it was successful or not is something we do need to be aware of. The assertion also produced a blind spot, as unlike the Holocaust, the psychological impact of which was discussed, the debates around the partition were almost absent. Despite the fact, as mentioned earlier, that there was already a significant awareness of the psychological issues leading up to and as a consequence of the partition. Satyanand, writing in the 1950s, by now the first professor of psychiatry at the newly established All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi, was forced to comment that the prevailing socio-economic state of the country was caused by defective and immature community ego development, and the low state of political and social and economic integration causes and maintains defective and immature community ego. To correct this would require a new design for a man, and India would be a good place to start as an emotional integration of the nation at the village level between subcultures, castes and professional groups was required if a feeling of belongingness, which was most essential for positive mental health. Thus, to summarize, the advent of modern medicine and psychiatry in 19th century India proved quite popular, as for the first time, healthcare was available in a non-sectarian manner. In the 19th century, ideas about universal psychological processes could begin to be imagined, but colonial rule and communitarian identities, whether real, amplified or fostered, did not allow an individual psychology to take deep root. The people of India were to be forever identified as representatives of groups and not as individuals. There was thus an unwillingness to acknowledge the individual trauma as also the individual guilt. After all, if everyone was a victim, then everyone could also be guilty. And when guilt is sliced into thin slices, it is perhaps useful to retreat into fantasy of tolerance, wisdom, and a golden age. The non-recognition of the biggest elephant in the room, the partition-linked violence and its handling, has also led to an under-recognition of the traumas and the consequences that violence engendered in subsequent decades. Sadly, even now, in what could be considered an extension of the colonial attitudes, communitarian identities are now thought to be sufficient to explain the subjective psyche and the overt behavior of persons, thus negating the need for a modern psychological understanding of self-willed, autonomous, and healthy ego structure in the citizens of the region. In this retreat from a secular universal humanism, even in contemporary times, there is a disconcerting promotion of localism, which encourages people to provide solutions within their own community. This is the same community that B.R. Ambedkar famously described as being, more often than not, a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. The negative impact on mental health of the spirals of violence that have followed by the ethnicity, religious, linguistic, and caste-based politics therefore has not been acknowledged, and no models for intervention have been developed. The violence of and on the other is seen as justifiable and retributive and almost has a totem value. It is not confronted as the banal evil which could, and indeed has, seeped into the body politic. This degradation of human life in both colonial and post-colonial modernity in South Asia, with its exploitation, asymmetry, and inequality, and the loss and withholding of a collective selfhood at peace with itself, as a consequence of the partition violence, thus has had many consequences. It has contorted the development and recovery of personhood in our times, and also impacted our thinking about mental health, especially since mental health is not viewed as an organic correlate of social health, and the psychological impact of this partitioning of minds and hearts can thus be ignored. 1,000 more cuts have been inflicted and experienced since then. A shared consciousness, a sense of belonging which was to be carefully fostered, is an ever-receding mirage, often displaced by a resurgence of identity politics, as well as the perpetual creation of a demonic other. Perhaps this is a sign of psychological malfunction of a faulty ego, as suggested by Satyanand and Vakil 3/4 of a century ago. To overcome this, as Beni Prasad had suggested in the 1940s, needs a constant and conscious effort to ensure social progress and to prevent a sliding back into an Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short, and ever smaller identities and states. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm glad to be part of this important discussion on intergenerational trauma. This is not a subject we deal with much in India. I mean, therapists and counselors may deal with it in their work, but on a day-to-day basis, it's not something that forms part of everyday discourse. And yet, I think it is a really important subject for us to deal with, because there are so many unresolved moments in our history that we need to address. But the question that really arises is, how in a society that is as polarized as ours and that is as hierarchical as ours, do you start to talk about this important subject, and what does it mean? Let me give you an example from Kashmir, the part of South Asia that both India and Pakistan have argued over since the moment that we became independent. In the year 1991, several decades ago, in 2 villages in Kashmir called Kunan and Poshpora, the army carried out what is called a search and seizure operation, seeking out militants who they thought may be hidden or hiding in the village and may have been kept in hiding by the villagers. So just to give a bit of explanation, Kashmir is a state, although it's no longer now a state, but it's a part of India that comes under a law which creates a state of exception and gives the army that is there special powers to do this kind of search and seizure operation. And militants in Kashmir at one point were often local young men and local boys. So the army went into this village late at night on February 23rd, 1991 to seek out young militants they thought may be hidden or hiding in the village. In the process, it is believed that maybe 30 to 40 women were raped by army soldiers. And this case then went to court after allegations of rape surfaced. But over the years, nothing much happened, and slowly it kind of just petered out. But the consequences were amazing, because the daughters, the women from that village, for many, many years, they could not marry or they could not find husbands, because the village itself came to be known as the village of raped women. And given the kind of stigma that sexual violence carries in our society, it wasn't surprising to see that men would not want to marry women from there. So in some ways, the trauma faced by the mothers was inherited by their daughters. Many, many years later, after this incident had faded from public memory, recently, in the last 10 years, a group of young women, all in their 20s, not related in any way to the women of Kunan Poshpora, except by also being Kashmiri themselves, looked at a case of sexual assault in Delhi and decided to re-explore their own history. And they succeeded in reopening discussions on the case, reopening proceedings on the case. And in doing so, they continued the search for justice and healing and honored the women who were their ancestors. So here you see two kinds of intergenerational things happening. One is that the direct descendants of the women who face the trauma actually suffer the consequences of that. And the other is how subsequent generations who take this as their history try to begin processes of healing. And I think both of those are extremely important. Now, I myself am not an expert on intergenerational trauma of any kind, but I have worked on a moment in our history, in the history of India, which was a moment of deep suffering for millions and millions of people, and that is the Partition of India in 1947, the moment when India became independent and was simultaneously partitioned in a bloody partition which killed millions of people. As a child growing up in young India, I was born 5 years after partition. I grew up with some knowledge of partition, but it was always very partial. What we learnt about in school was about political leaders and political parties, but we heard very little about what happened to people. My own family was a family deeply divided by partition, and yet as a young person growing up, I remained indifferent to these stories. It was only much later that these stories started coming home to me, and then I began work on interviewing people to listen to their stories of what had happened at the time, and discovered how these stories simultaneously inhabit a sphere of speech and silence, that they remain silenced, or they did remain silenced in wider society. But in the communities from which people came, in the families to which they belonged, they talked about these things all the time. And I want to tell you one such story about this. I met a man called Bir Bahadur Singh, who I interviewed on several occasions or over a longish period of time. And he told me this terrible history, that he was 11 years old when partition happened. The villages to which he belonged, a cluster of villages, were under sustained attack. And at some point, all people gathered inside the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, in the hope that banding together might bring them some safety in numbers. But when it became clear that the attacks were imminent, the elders, consisting of men and women, got together and decided first that they would kill the women and children of their own community in order to, within quotes, save them and save their honor from being violated by men of the other community. Bir Bahadur stood in the Sikh temple and watched his father kill his 16-year-old sister. How does an 11-year-old boy carry this memory into his adult life for years and years afterwards? And it wasn't only this thing. Another thing happened. Shortly after the incident where men killed their own children, sometimes their wives, it is said that about 85 women in that same cluster decided to take their own lives by jumping into a nearby well. Bir Bahadur's mother was one of those women. She did not die. In the end, she survived. And for this young man growing up in India, what he carried with him was the trauma of seeing the violence done to his sister and others, the fear of losing his mother, the, I suppose, happiness or relief at not having lost her, but also very complicated feeling of being cheated by the survival of his mother, of the kind of tag of being the family of a martyr. Because she did not die, the family was not fully, realistically, theoretically a martyr's family. So all of these things are things that our society has carried with it through into the present day, and these things remain unaddressed in many ways. So while Bir Bahadur's story is at least available to us, we really have no way of knowing what those women who jumped into the well, what they thought, what went through their minds, how do we recover their experience, and we have very little way of finding out what their children, who are scattered all over, would have inherited of this story. So similarly, it is by now widely known that at the time of partition, thousands of women were subjected to sexual assault and sexual violence. So while today in our society, because of the conditions around us and because of the intervention of many young researchers, we are beginning to hear more of these stories, it is almost too late for many of them because most of the survivors have gone. But also the question of sexual violence remains one that we don't as yet have answers to, because for women who underwent sexual violence, how to speak about a subject for which there is no vocabulary in a society that hardly addresses the subject of sex, let alone sexual violence, and how to speak about that experience and hand down that knowledge to the next generation in a way that the next generation is not ashamed of their mothers. Because, as I said when I spoke about Kashmir and Kunan Poshpora, sexual violence carries such a lot of stigma with it, which sticks to the victim, the survivor. So how will their families, the generations that come, deal with it? And often in my work on partition, I was requested by survivors of sexual violence when I did speak to them to not tell their stories in such a way that they could be identified. In fact, years ago, I found a book, a government publication, which listed in it the names of thousands of women who had gone through sexual violence. And till today, as a researcher and a writer, I have not had the courage to publicize that, because the question is, what is good about this, speech or silence? To whom do we owe responsibility, to the survivors or to some search for truth? And this is a question that researchers are grappling with today. So there are so many things about the important subject of intergenerational trauma that we need to address, that we need to be open about. For us also, looking at partition becomes difficult because it is not an easy subject. There are no easily identifiable aggressors and victims. In many ways, we are all complicit in perpetrating the violence or in remaining silent about it, and to address that kind of trauma is that much more difficult. But I think given how endemic violence and hatred are becoming in our society, I cannot emphasize enough the necessity and importance of dealing with this important subject in sensitive ways, because it will not only help us to remember and to heal, but it will also help us to honor those who have gone, and it will also help us to bring justice to their memories.
So, welcome to our panel on talking intergenerational trauma with a focus on India. You have already heard the presentations, and I wish we had a live panel with an audience that could ask questions of the panelists or comment on their presentations. But that is not to be. So the questions and comments have to come from the people you see live on the screen. You are familiar with their bios from their talks, so I will introduce them very briefly. Amrita Narayanan is a psychoanalyst and writer, currently visiting professor of psychology at Kriya University. Her upcoming book is on modern women's sexuality in India. Hemanti Roy teaches history at the University of Dayton. She is the author, Partition Lives, Citizen Refugees, Migrants in India and Pakistan. Professor Sanjeev Jain, unfortunately, cannot be with us, who's at the Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, because as it seems, we are talking about trauma at a time where, at least when this is being recorded, India is being traumatized. And then Urvashi Butalia has over 35 years of experience in feminist and independent publishing, also has a long involvement in women's movement in India. And one of her most important books is The Study of Partition, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. So now what is intergenerational trauma? Simply put, and adapting Amrita Narayanan's quote, in trauma, something is remembered that would rather be forgotten. One could say that in intergenerational trauma, a succeeding generation or generations remember a cataclysmic event that the previous generation has gone through, but would rather have forgotten. Most of the panelists have focused on the partition of British India into two independent states of India and Pakistan, an event which involved an unprecedented scale of suffering, which the panelists have talked about in their presentations. But trauma does not have to be one momentous event. Hemanti Roy has told us that the hallmark of partition was its divergent experience extending over time that depended on gender, religion, region, caste, age. Partition was experienced very differently in North India as compared to Pakistan. Individuals in both countries may have experienced it very similarly, with loss of homes, lives of loved ones, but the collective imagination ascribes very different outcomes. Traumatic loss in the Indian case, a victory in a war of independence in case of Pakistan. Now, most of the literature on intergenerational trauma has the Holocaust squarely in its focus. As far as I know, I think that was the origins of the transmission of intergenerational trauma, the Holocaust. So my first question to Hemanti, and of course to other members of the panel who may wish to join in after Hemanti's response, is the partition of British India comparable to the Holocaust, which is well circumscribed in time and holds a universal meaning for the Jews, or at least with a minimum of divergence? Or can it be compared in some ways with the partition and not others? The Holocaust is also clear-cut in its division between perpetrators and victims, a division which may not be so clear-cut in case of partition, as Urvashi has also alluded to. So there can also be a cumulative trauma, which Amrita has referred to, and on which she can perhaps elaborate a little afterwards. But first, Hemanti, if you would like to address this question.
Thank you, Sudhir. That's a great question and a great way for us to start thinking about intergenerational trauma. As a historian, I always kind of find it difficult to compare two very specific and very distinct sites and events, such as the Holocaust and the partition, even though they happened in the same decade, almost within 4 or 5 years of each other. As we know, the Holocaust happened within the context of war, within the context of state genocide, with a lot of infrastructure directed at a minority community. Now, there are some, obviously, some similarities, but I would say that the partition and the trauma that it generated was very different and far in a very distinct way complex compared to the Holocaust. And I'll just elaborate a little bit here. In that, in the partition, there were no clear perpetrators, no clear victims. It was not, to a certain extent, mandated or structured around state, authorities. It was also sometimes not planned. It engendered large mass movements, which was traumatic in itself. The violence was very different, as you pointed out, in terms of the Eastern and the Western experiences. Especially in the Eastern part, the violence continues in a very chronic, everyday fashion, which is not the case during the Holocaust. In the West, the partition violence is more, one would imagine, bounded, but it's really not. It bleeds out beyond 1949 and continues to impact families and relatives and children. And you see far more in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of the range of people. So it's not one community who has been affected. You see the experience of, say, the Dalits. You see the experience of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. It would seem that the partition did not leave anybody untouched, either directly or indirectly. So in that sense, I don't see a similarity, but on the other hand, in terms of memory, in terms of the trauma that has continued on in terms of families, that is something that I would say is very similar. And we can talk a little bit more maybe later about memorialization, which is happening now. In terms of the Holocaust, the memorialization happens almost within the decade in terms of remembering, in terms of institutions, in terms of creating museums and structures for a community to remember. We are only starting to do that. And that speaks something about how the trauma has filtered through generations. I'll let Urvashi or Amrita speak at this point, and I can come back.
Urvashi, would you?
Well, I think Hemanti has said most of it, and I absolutely agree that it's very difficult to compare two such different things that grow out of such different historical contexts and with such different historical roots in their particular countries. The only thing that I would say is that there are, of course, points of similarity that one can find, but those one can find in many traumatic moments of many traumatic upheavals of the political kind across the world, where you see, for example, sexual violence against women, and you see families being torn apart, and you see the loss of property and all of those things. But in the overall context, I would say they're two very, very distinct things. Mm-hmm. Even, for example, Sudhir, in the vocabulary that is available to describe them, I mean, when you use the word Holocaust, it actually calls up something that can at least approximate to what happened, at the time, the biblical nature of it, etc. When you use the word partition, it's such a mundane, everyday word that can serve for many other things. So there's that as well.
Yeah, okay. Amrita, if you could talk a little about cumulative trauma. I just wanted to put the notion of cumulative trauma on the table because I feel that a majority of Indian Muslims today does not look at the partition as traumatic, but the cumulative effect in the last 2 or 3 decades of discrimination, of being regarded as second-class citizens and living in India at the sufferance of the Hindu majority. And that may well be regarded, or can be, but I leave it for discussion, as a cumulative trauma. And perhaps, Amrita, if you can tell us a little more about cumulative trauma itself, the notion, And then Urvashi can tell us more about the interviews with Indian Muslims. And Himanti Roy perhaps would also like to join in.
Yes. The concept of cumulative trauma is, of course, as you already mentioned, the repetitive nature of the trauma. But in particular, there's the idea that the parent is not able to protect the child from the trauma that's going on, and partly because the parent's investment into the narrative that's going on at that time is very strong. So the example that I have taken up in my part of the talk is on women's sexuality and how the parent is supposed to play the role for the girl child of allowing for the sexuality to awaken, to evolve, to be enacted. But in the case of a cumulative trauma, the parent's not able to play that supportive role that the child very much needs because the parent's loyalties are with the group and the patriarchy that feels that the girl's sexuality must be controlled. So the appropriate protectiveness of the parent is not in place because the parent's loyalties lie elsewhere. So basically, that's the concept of cumulative trauma, when the parent is not able to protect the child at a very critical stage when the child needs their protection.
Anyone else would like to join in? What I was asking from the other side is what do you think is the experience of Indian Muslims, and as compared to, or if you don't want to compare or to Hindu, whether the partition in North Indian Muslims perhaps is very different from in Bengal, but is it a similar one to the Hindus, or is it much more of this slow traumatization which is going on, which I use as cumulative trauma now, which is more traumatic for them than the partition, which one would look at?
If I could come in here, you asked earlier about the interviews I had done. So drawing on those, what I found was it wasn't a uniform experience where Indian Muslims were concerned, because the experience was very different depending on where the Muslims were located. And I don't mean only geographically. For example, the Indian Muslim in the Punjab was deeply indebted to the Hindu landlord and the Hindu shopkeeper, whereas the Indian Muslim in UP was in a different situation altogether, and the Indian Muslim in Bengal was different, and the Indian Muslim in Hyderabad would have been in a somewhat different kind of situation. So there is a variability in the experience, but what I found among the people that I talked to was, a sense of the trauma that they had gone through, but also a sense of somehow, I don't know what the word is, maybe settledness at having made a choice of staying on in the country they believe to be theirs. And that settledness somehow communicated itself to the next generation. And which is why the Indian Muslims have by and large been a peaceable people. And then the betrayal of that settledness, the betrayal of that, it makes you look back thinking, did I make the right choice? Did my parents make the right choice? What is there for me in this country? And that is, as you so rightly point out, is something that is actually happening more and more today, and is happening because of the kind of politics we are living through. And I'm sorry, but when I mentioned Bengal, I should have also mentioned Assam, because actually that is where the Indian Muslim has been so deeply traumatized. And, the decision to make India the home and the country has been thrown up in question again and again and passed down through generations, and specifically the impact on Muslim women, lack of identity, no name, getting lost out of the parental family, having no real identity in the married family, and then comes the NRC, and what do? You just don't exist. So I don't know, I think the Muslim experience is quite variable.
Urvashi, I'll just kind of add a little bit, since you rightly brought in Assam, I would definitely, in terms of what I've been working on, in terms of the citizenship debate that has been going on, Assam really is, it's not a question of betrayal from India, it's a betrayal of region, right? Where these kind of debates have been going on for a long time, but the Indian Muslims in Assam have also been battling ethno-linguistic nationalism, right? And to have the NRC and the citizenship debates, I feel it brings to a certain sense a betrayal of region, right? A region that they called home is now under question. So we also need to kind of move away from this kind of nationalistic framework, right? As in, that's what we have been kind of operating on, to kind of think about it regionally. And you're right that, the Muslims in Assam have a very different experience than Muslims even in Bengal, which is also a border state. And the citizenship debates, and in this I refer to the 2019 citizenship amendment and the NRC, the National Register, that has been really brought into relief in the last decade or so, even though the seeds have been sown much earlier in 2003, 2004. This kind of, and the argument is that it impacts everyone, every Indian citizen, but we know that it impacts one group adversely far more than anyone else. And it has got me thinking about the partition and what it meant about belonging. And yet again, you have to consistently prove, in a certain sense, loyalty, prove belonging. And that is something that I think this intergenerational trauma just, it brings up. It hasn't gone away. And of course, we can talk a little bit more about that, as in the memories that come up in a very different context.
Sudhir, can I ask a question of Amrita? May I?
Yes, of course.
Actually, Amrita, I'd really like to hear from you, since your work is on sexuality and on gender. What you might speculate about the ways in which, say, women who experience sexual violence, the trauma of that might have been passed down through to their children, their daughters, their families?
Yes, absolutely. So if we think about how such a trauma is passed along, I think it's kind of illuminating, because it happens on one level. It's a very direct trauma transmission, happens when the child feels this empathic identification with the mother who has had this sexual trauma. And that can happen if the mother directly shares her story, but more likely it happens through these acts of imitation and mimicry, in which the child is patterning herself after the mother, and therefore patterning herself, in your example, in expectation of abuse, in equations like sex equals danger. So this empathic identification turns out as a process of mimicry, as a process of patterning. And so the history of trauma gets fed into the child through this imitative process. And a role also gets taken up. So the child could internalize the role of a victim, for example, the most obvious one, but also of aggressor. And these roles can get triggered in other situations in the young girl's life. And after that, she's sort of repeating things that she has memorized, as it were, through the process of living with her mother, but she's repeating them in other contexts. So even though it's not necessarily the story of her life, the story of her mother's life is getting replayed through her.
So interesting. We know so little about this.
Sorry?
No, I was just saying how little we know about this, how little we've thought of these aspects of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. I think we will come back to it, maybe, of the mitigation of this intergenerational trauma, because there are really kind of two things we are talking of here. One is the people who have suffered the trauma directly and their descendant, to which generations they go, and we know. And the other part is the trauma when it becomes in part of a collective memory, so which is a very different kind of a thing. So if I thought first let's go to this collective trauma finishing, and then wanting to come to Amrita. And I'm sorry Sanjeev Jain is not there, because he would have had also experience on how does one mitigate, what does one do, what are the ways to do the mitigation of that trauma. But in the collective trauma, of course, what I really wanted to say was that you have, Urvashi, you've already said that the distinction between the direct descendants and the succeeding generation for which the trauma becomes an enduring part of history. I think the collective memories elevate a few and very few of the traumas suffered by a community throughout its history into what Vamik Volkan has called a chosen trauma. Now, chosen trauma refers to an event that caused a community to feel helpless and victimized, which is constantly dwelt upon and whose mental representation becomes embedded in the group's collective identity. So chosen trauma does not mean that either the Hindus or the Muslims in North India chose to become victims, but only they have chosen to psychologically internalize and thus constantly dwell upon a particular period of their history. So chosen trauma is reactivated again and again to strengthen a community's cohesion through memories of its persecution. Partition is perhaps one of the chosen traumas for the Hindus, but not for the Muslims, as we've been discussing. But I have heard it referred to in speeches by religious political demagogues whenever a Hindu-Muslim conflict comes to the fore. Thus, in Hindu Demagogue in 1992, at the eve of violence between the two communities in Hyderabad, talks of what the Hindus got from partition and India with its arms cut off. She's referring to the map of India without the two wings of Pakistan. If one looks at the political speeches on ground in the ongoing Bengal elections, holding up the specter of mini Pakistans being created if the ruling party comes to power, I think testifies to the hold of partition as a chosen trauma in the imagination of many Hindus. Not true of Indian Muslims, I think, where it is the demolition of Babri Masjid which bids to become a chosen trauma. Of course, there are more than one chosen traumas that are often activated. For the Hindus of North and Central India, the destruction of Somnath temple by Mahmud Ghazni in medieval time is another chosen trauma. You will hear it referred to speeches, as I said, of religious demagogues on eves of religious violence at various places. As beside the Holocaust, it is the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD for the Jews. Indian Muslims too conjure up other chosen traumas from their history. When a demagogue, and I'm again quoting one of them at the eve, we have come through the battlefields of Karbala, which refers to the battle in 60-80 AD, in which the grandson of the Prophet and most of his men lost their lives. We have passed through the valleys of Spain, through the hills of Gibraltar. And this refers to the end of Islamic rule in Spain, the grief that followed it, and which has been called the Andalus syndrome. So my point is that it may well nigh be impossible to eradicate a trauma that has been incorporated in a community's history, because it is needed to forge a sense of cohesion. But it may be possible to elevate or treat it in the direct descendants before it can become a chosen trauma. So first, I'd like to invite the panelists to comment on that, and then also invite the panelists and here, beginning with Amrita, their views on how to proceed towards healing of collective trauma directly in the generations, succeeding generations.
Could I come in and comment on what you're saying? Because Amrita you're going to address the healing after that, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Am I stealing the space, your space? No.
Not stealing the healing.
So, Sudhir, I wanted to just reaffirm the point you're making by telling you a story from my research, which isn't about the sort of collective trauma that you're talking about, which is a much bigger scale thing that a community totalizes and imagines for itself, but a smaller sort of version of that. But it really, it's interesting. So the story is from Punjab in March of 1947. When in the villages, Punjab meaning undivided Punjab, and in the villages in the Rawalpindi area, which later went to Pakistan, there was one village called Thoa Khalsa. And there, it was the Sikh community that was under attack. And they all banded together in the Sikh temple for safety. But when it became apparent that safety was not going to be there when they were getting attacked, the particular forms of violence within the community took place. The men got together and killed their own women. And then about 85 women are said to have jumped into a well and killed themselves. And this incident has become iconic and it's been used in films and there are stories around it and so on. One of the people I interviewed was the son of a woman who had tried to drown in the well, but who had not succeeded. Because by the time, it's a terrible history, by the time she jumped in, the well had filled up with too many bodies and there wasn't enough water to drown her. And the complex way in which this history was inherited by her son was like a sense of relief that he had not lost his mother, but a sense of betrayal that his mother had not become a martyr, which would have given the family the status of martyrs. Then in the community in Delhi, in South Delhi, in a place called Jangpura, where communities from those areas came to live post-partition, in the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple there, every year there is a ceremony to commemorate this moment in their history. And when you listen to that ceremony and the ways in which the stories are told and retold, it is doing exactly what you're talking about. It's whipping up the community into a frenzy of anger, hatred at what has been done to them as a community, and therefore solidifying that identity. And yet, now, 75 years on, that ceremony has kind of faded out because there are no survivors left to tell those stories, and the stories are not so powerful if they're told as received. So, you know, just in that one little story, you can get so many aspects of the collective trauma that you were talking about. And I just wanted to mention that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. What about the mitigation of trauma through generations or even otherwise? And if Amrita could.
Yes, as you said, Sudhir, I think trauma is such a powerful source of identification. And the example that Urvashi gives also illustrates that. So the getting out of it is not as simple as it might seem. It's not like getting out of other kinds of pain, because if you win by getting out of it, you also lose. You lose your identification. And as the example you gave, there's some glory and collective memory and group cohesiveness that are embedded in that identification. And all those are lost if one is to get better, get out of it, forget the trauma. So remembering preserves the identification. Forgetting is healing, but the identification gets lost. And so there's a rupture, even though there may be more rapture. And I think that's the very tricky part of getting over trauma. When it comes to mitigating it or healing it, I think historically psychoanalysis and psychology has had the position that speaking about it and the cathartic process of speaking is healing. But of course, as Urvashi raised in her presentation, this is fraught. It's not quite clear. What is it that a speech act does? That is not always clear. So if the effect of speaking of the trauma is something that both the speaker and the listener have to gauge in order to know if sort of we're on the path to healing, if there's, if one can even describe such a path. I think speaking can be helpful if it facilitates what psychoanalysts famously call mourning, that the trauma can be grieved in a way that frees up the energies to live forward and to have more life, as it were. But the effect of speaking can equally be a re-experiencing, a reenactment, a rebonding to the original kinds of painfulness that the trauma represented. So I think what's really critical is not simply speaking, but at each stage a reflection upon what kinds of emotional conversations and what kinds of identifications are stirred up, both in the speaker and in the listener. And then what do these identifications, what effect do they have upon the living of our lives in other ways? Is it take our life forward, or does it sort of harken back to the past in ways that harm the day-to-day living of life?
If I may just quickly chime in, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but it would seem to me that, 70 years down the line, we are really talking about a generation who only has received memory. And one way that, and I bring back the point about memorialization, is to think about trauma in terms of objects and things that have been passed down, not only stories and memories, but through items of clothing, items of jewelry, books, which do, and again, it's more of a question than a comment. It might be useful for us to think about how trauma itself has changed, and would it be mitigated in kind of objectifying these things, and in terms of family histories, because we are talking about collective trauma, and that I think Urvashi mentioned earlier about politicizing it in the current elections in West Bengal, and that hasn't changed. But I think in terms of personal and family trauma, that has substantially changed its nature to a path of healing. And would that be accurate, Amrita or Urvashi, from your interviews?
Well, I can certainly chime in on this part of that memory is what is being handed down. And I'm not sure I fully agree. I think certainly memory is handed down, but also identifications and internalized roles are handed down from parent to child. And those remain in the consciousness, but without actually the tethering that memory offers to it. So memory could give some meaning to it, but oftentimes if the memory is no longer spoken about, but the role or the form of identity that's associated with that memory is still present, then that gets passed forward. As for objects, I think it really depends on the person and how they're using those objects. Much like speech, objects can also be used either to re-experience roles that are helpful or not helpful. So I think that part is a very subjective process. But maybe Sudhir has more to add.
No, I thought you asked Urvashi also.
Yes, I'm not sure about your point that the nature of trauma itself has changed. Although I wouldn't say that it has stood still. I mean, some kind of change, I guess, is inevitable. But I haven't thought enough about that to say, to comment really intelligently on that. What I would say is that I think it's, in a sense, it's really important for the healing process to find ways of giving expression to that trauma. And giving expression means finding the language, finding a hospitable environment in which what you want to say can be heard or read or seen. And that is why things like the different ways in which societies that have gone through trauma create, memory books and various other things. But I think having said that, you can't actually do that in a society that is not willing to confront its own past. And I think we singularly excel at that. We only want to haul out of our past selective memories that serve, very instrumentally serve our purposes of political mobilization and so on today. But even as a society, we are not really willing to think back to a past, especially partition, which would force us to think of our own complicity in creating the kind of traumatic and horrible and violent situations that happened. So I think the forms of expression now, things are coming out. And now, as Amrita says, and as you said, it's a received memory because that generation has died out quite a lot. And I think also this object thing is interesting, but for me, who has the luxury to bring objects with them or keep objects with them at that kind of time? And another question that doesn't go away for me is really who has the luxury to remember? Because for women who have been through sexual violence and who have been abducted and raped and kept in captivity, not only are there no words, no language, no vocabulary, but no one to listen. And if they have to survive, they have to forget. They have to obliterate that memory. So I don't know what happens to trauma there. You know, that's something that I don't think I'm qualified to talk about, but I just know that I've seen it in a lot of people I've talked
to. The mitigation of trauma, I mean, is that it's not only when the person is ready to talk, because one doesn't really know that. It's also this, whether it can be done on an individual basis or is it better in a community group basis. And that would depend really on the nature of the society and also the person, age, stage, and my suggestion was that this very individual-centered mitigation of trauma, of taking a person, it's okay, it's fine, but it is very insufficient for the huge number of people who have gone through a collective kind of a trauma part of it. And they're much more community-centered approaches. And when Urvashi was talking of this Gurdwara part of it, that seemed to be very much a community-centered approach. Okay, it was not a healing, perhaps not a mitigation of trauma, but whether after bringing it up, talked about it, whether there was more to it, that okay, we have survived it, we should put it behind it, whether that was also coming out. So I have no idea about whether that. But what I was suggesting was that one should really look at the much more of the community-centered approaches in a country or a place like ours, where the luxury of dealing with individuals is a luxury. It's too few. It may be the best one to be able to do it, but that it may not be such a possibility.
Actually, I agree. And Sudhir, I just wanted to say you're right. And that process that we were talking about in the Gurdwara, where this happened, over time, the anger got toned down. Yeah. And then it began to become the kind of process you're talking about. Because then what do you get angry about? You know, the memory is fading. And so then it began to become much more about the community and what the community could do and putting it behind us and forgetting it and so on.
Mm-hmm. So, any other comments, etc.?
I wonder if we could come back to this idea of objects and what objects do to people. As I imagine many people in the audience also are viewing objects that have some relationship to trauma. So I was curious to hear the rest of your thoughts upon that, objects and how they have, what they do to a person when you're viewing them.
So I don't know, for me, I'm thinking in the context of partition. So again, one can't I can't really go beyond that because my research has been there. And I'm thinking that, okay, even in my own family, my parents brought some things with them, like my grandfather's account book and a few other things which helped them as to preserve the memory of that time. But many of the people that I talked to who were really, you know, the poor ironing man or the beggar on the street, or they had nothing to bring. So I think it's important to think of objects, but it's important to also think of them, at least in our society, in relation to the nature of the flight, how it happened, or the nature of the migration, and class. I mean, I don't know how I can say that less crassly, if you like. But you can bring an object if you have an object to bring.
We are very shortly have to end.
I just wanted to quickly add that sometimes objects are not.
My last question was this: if you want to quickly add something which you would wanted to say and couldn't do it, if you could do it, I have added too much. I think Urvashi has added quite a lot also. So Amrita and Hemanti, the last anything which you wanted to say, which I'm sorry I didn't ask.
So I just wanted to quickly add that objects sometimes are things that become objects. So things like your passport or your migration certificates, which people bring in. And this is more the case when it's a prolonged displacement. I also wanted to kind of ask our audience to think about diaspora and location of this generation who are beyond India and beyond the boundaries of South Asia, so to speak, and how they think about the memories of partition. And that's something that maybe we could, again, in a future, think about that.
Amrita?
Don't have anything to add at this moment.
Okay. So then we're exactly in time, 7:10. So thank you very much. And thank you to our unseen audience. I hope they have also enjoyed it as I did. And
thank you, Sudhir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.